A Shot in the Dark by Silverpup. Chapter 1. Gandalf observed the hobbit before him, carefully. As far as hobbits went, he seemed no different from any other. He was of the average height and build for his race, which was short and dense. He was dressed, as most hobbits were, in a simple and modest attire of a button-down short brown trousers and no shoes. His thick hair was properly trimmed around his face, and he smelled of soap and fresh bread. As far as appearances went, Bilbo Baggins seemed very much a respectable hobbit. Too bad he had never put much stake in appearances. "Good morning," he greeted pleasantly, planting his staff into the ground and leaning against it slightly. The hobbit glanced up at him from beneath his thick brown curls. He stared at him for a moment with light brown eyes, Belladonna's eyes, he noted, before a wide smile broke out across his face. "Good morning, Master Gandalf," Bilbo returned, raising his pipe in greeting. Gandalf's brows met his hairline. He had not expected to be recognized, least of all by the very one he had sought out. "You know me, my young friend?" "Of course. My mother spoke very highly of you until the end of her days." The hobbit took a puff of his pipe and blew out a lazy smoke ring. "We Baggins never forget a friend, you know, even one we have not seen in decades." "Indeed." He did not know if he was to feel happy, proud, or surprised by these turn of events. The perplexing feelings made him want to smile widely, for it had been far too long since he had been this entertained. "Since you seem to know me so well, might I ask you a question?" Bilbo waved a lazy hand. "Ask away, good sir." He leaned forward and tilted his hat up so he could meet the young hobbit's eyes full on. "I am looking for someone to share an adventure with me. Would you care to be that one?" Bilbo's polite expression did not change, but he did put his pipe down in his lap. "Perhaps. But first, tell me more of this adventure." This time Gandalf did not hold back his smile. Once Gandalf was on his way with a promise to return for dinner, Bilbo calmly stood up and walked back into his house, shut the door and locked it, and then proceeded to have a minor breakdown. "Oh, sweetheart, I can't believe I just did that," he thought, leaning his back against the door and slowly sliding to the floor. It had taken every ounce of self-control not to break down and tell the wizard every little thing that was to happen with Thorin and company, Frodo and the ring, or even of Saruman and his betrayal. And to have to look into the face of his oldest and dearest friend and lie. Bilbo wasn't sure how he was going to face the rest of his dead companions if he couldn't even face Gandalf for 5 minutes. "Stop it, Bilbo. You can do this. Just remember why you are telling these lies in the first place," he reminded himself firmly. "You made a plan. Now stick with it." After recognizing the rare opportunity had been given, and having a mental breakdown over the possibilities, Bilbo had constructed a plan. It was a very basic plan that followed one line of thought. Do not let anyone die again. He had made it simple because he realized that he could not change every little detail of their journey just because it suited him. There were certain events that had to happen, like Thorin's battle with Azog, even if he didn't like them. Though he was still on the fence about the troll situation. Being used as a troll handkerchief had not been his finest moment. Of course, his true problem lay not in making a plan, but in acting on it. Bilbo knew it was easy to say that he would do this and that when the time came, and he had no fear that he would fail to act when it did. No, the real challenge lay in reliving days he had already experienced with people he already treasured, but who would see him as nothing more than an outsider. How was he to look upon the faces of his dear companions once more, to see them again before age and death had taken their toll, and pretend that they were nothing more than a stranger to him? How could he laugh and smile with them while knowing that 3 of them would never live to see their home restored to its former glory? How was he supposed to lie and pretend that he did not mourn a lifetime away for their dear leader? "Stop that, Bilbo, you old goat. You don't have time for a pity party," he scolded at himself out loud, shaking his head. He gave himself a light smack on the cheek, forced himself to stand, and marched to the kitchen. He did not have time to wallow in doubts and insecurities. He had 13 hungry dwarves to prepare dinner for. From what he recalled, the first dwarf to arrive would be Dwalin. The first time he had met the burly and blunt dwarf, Bilbo had been rightfully intimidated. Tall for his kind and equally robust, Dwalin was easily the most menacing dwarf he had ever met. Because of this fear, he had skirted around him like a mouse the entire time it had been just the two of them. It was only later on in their journey, after he had gotten to know Dwalin better, that he had learned that by acting so skittish, he had not only lessened his worth in the dwarf's eyes, but also reinforced every reason why Dwalin didn't trust outsiders. So that was why he was going to do things a bit different this time around. That evening, when his doorbell rang, Bilbo calmly stood up and went to answer his door. When he opened it, he found the tattooed dwarf standing dressed in the same gold belt and green cloak he recalled from so long ago. "Good evening," he greeted, giving Dwalin a wide smile. "You must be one of the dwarves Master Gandalf mentioned. I am Bilbo Baggins, and you are most welcomed in my home. Do come inside." Dwalin stared at him for a moment with his dark brows raised high, before giving a jerky nod and ducked aside. "My thanks. I'm Dwalin, son of Fundin. Where's the kitchen?" "I have prepared dinner for all of us. Come this way." Bilbo turned around and walked back to his dining room, knowing the dwarf would follow. When they entered the room, he heard a quick intake of breath and smirked. "I hope this will be enough to feed you and your fellows. I do not know how much dwarves like to eat, but we hobbits love food," he said casually, rolling his head back to get a good look at Dwalin's face. The dwarf was wide-eyed and his mouth had fallen open. Of course, he had every right to be shocked. Every inch of Bilbo's table was covered with food. From savory cooked lamb to smoked sausages, he had not held back with his meal. He had done so because he recalled quite well how much this group could devour in one sitting, so instead of waiting for them to raid his larder like the last time, he had pulled out all the food he had stored away, paid a visit to the market nearby, and cooked up a feast fit for a small army. Or, in this case, 13 dwarves and 1 wizard. "Aye, this looks like a fine meal. I'm sure the others will enjoy it greatly," Dwalin finally commented, pulling his gaze away from the table to give him a squinty-eyed glare. "Why did you do all of this? It must have taken you hours." "Why, because you are my guests. I don't know about you dwarves, but we hobbits always treat our guests with the utmost respect. And in this case, that means feeding them until they are no longer hungry," he scolded, giving the dwarf a glare. He wasn't really bothered by the question because it was such a Dwalin thing to be suspicious over a good meal. However, he did so enjoy making the dwarf look guilty over questioning his good intentions. Bilbo could admit that he had grown into a devious old habit. "My apologies. I was just not expecting to be treated to a feast." Dwalin tilted his head and stared at him with an open and frank expression. "Do all hobbits really do this for their guests?" "Well, not all of them. Some of them can be quite rude and stingy," he admitted, recalling his distant, as far as he was concerned, cousins, the Sackville Bagginses. "I am not one of those, and neither are most of my family members. Now come, pull up a seat and get started. I'm sure the others will be here soon enough." Dwalin gave him another questioning look, but pulled his cloak off and took a seat against the wall. He stabbed at a piece of fish and gave it a quick sniff before shrugging and digging in. Bilbo leaned against the wall and watched him. Dwalin had been a dear companion to him, but they had not been as close as he was with Balin and Bolfer. Instead, Dwalin had been Thorin's right hand and dear friend throughout their travels. He could never bring himself to be jealous over their familial bond, but did regret never building a bond with Dwalin himself. But then again, he regretted not doing a lot of things in his lifetime. "Are you going to eat or stare at me?" the warrior growled, never pausing as he tore the meat off a chicken bone. Bilbo jumped slightly before giving an awkward laugh. I'm sorry, I'm just curious is all. Never met a dwarf in person, after all." Dwalin snorted. "Well, you'll get an eyeful soon enough." Oh, how very true. A solid knock on his front door echoed through the halls and made him jolt. He had forgotten that the rest would soon be following. I'll just go get that. You continue waiting." Dwalin gave a grunt in answer, but did not look away from his meal. Bilbo headed to the door, straining his memory for who it would be. Other than Dwalin arriving first and Thorin arriving last, he could not quite recall who came in between. Shrugging, he opened the door and found a tall dwarf with a battle axe strapped to his back standing before him. It was Balin. The last time he sees Balin is before he sets out for Moria. His old friend has aged well and is eager to set out on his newest adventure. He invites Bilbo to come along with him, but he declines since he cannot leave Frodo on his own just yet. So instead, they spend the evening laughing and recalling the humorous parts of their journey while keeping silent of those days that were not so wonderful. I think it's going to rain later, Balin commented, staring up at the sky. Really? I hope it clears up by dawn then, Bilbo returned automatically, even as he felt his throat tighten up at the familiar voice. Balin laughed and turned to face him. He looked the same as Bilbo remembered, with his prematurely white hair, twinkling dark eyes, and kind smile. The sight of his old friend made that crack in him widen even more. Oh yes, that would be good. Right, we cannot really trudging through the rain, Balin agreed, stepping into his home. Bilbo stepped back and allowed the dwarf entry before closing the door behind him. I am Bilbo Baggins, he introduced, straining to keep his voice from shaking. Please, make yourself at home. Ah, my thanks. I am Balin, son of Undin. Wonderful home you got here. Very warm and cozy, Balin said cheerfully, unwinding his red cloak. I've never seen the inside of a hobbit house. I was expecting something a bit draftier, to be honest. Balin! Dwalin had apparently heard his brother's voice and had ventured out of the dining room to find them. Bilbo watched the two brothers greet one another with a head of butts and realized for the first time that the two had most likely not seen one another for years. Living on whatever work they could find meant that they most likely had gone separate ways in order to make a living. It was another reminder of what his dwarven companions had been forced into due to smog. Come along, that's dinner waiting for us, said Balin, guiding his brother back towards the dining room. Oh, excellent! I wondered if there would be food here, Balin commented cheerfully. Bilbo watched them go and played with the idea of following them before dismissing the thought. He would allow them the chance to catch up without having to worry about eavesdropping hobbits. Besides, he needed a chance to compose himself. If seeing Balin left him feeling unsteady, then he could only imagine how he would feel seeing the rest. He rubbed his forehead and patted his cheeks a few times before he felt composed again. It was just in time, too, as there was another knock on his door. This time it was harder and louder, as if two fists had beat upon it. Two fists. That surely means it's... With a heavy heart, Bilbo opened the door again, and this time found two young dwarves standing on his doorstep. One was clearly older, with his golden hair tied back in braids, and a beard that was only now long enough to braid. The other was taller, with wild dark hair, and only the barest hint of facial hair. Both were well-armed and wearing identical impish grins. Fili, began the blonde, and Kili, added the other. At your service. They finished in unison before giving a short and succinct bow. When he finally finds the two brothers, he finds a sight that will haunt him for years to come. Kili lies on his back with his eyes closed and his young face ghostly white. There are arrows impaled in his chest, and his lifeblood has created an ocean beneath him. Fili lies close to him on his chest with a sword and dagger wedged into his back. One hand is stretched out to his brother's hair, his face and blank eyes still fixed on Kili. Even in the end, he still tries to protect his little brother. Bilbo Baggins, he returned quietly, the crack in his heart now a full-blown gap. Pleased to meet you both. Please come inside and join the others for dinner. There's food? Great, I'm starving. Kili pushed past him without hesitation, practically bouncing into the house with all the energy of a pup. He began to pull off his weapons and dropped them into one of the chests that Bilbo had discreetly left out for them. Fili followed at a more sedated pace, but with all the confidence and grace that could only come from youth. He too began to strip off his weapons and left them in one of the chests, all the while taking in the house around him with painfully familiar blue eyes. Bigger than I thought it would be, commented Fili as he began to pull out his stash of many knives. That's because you thought hobbits lived in holes in the ground with the mud and worms, Kili mocked, reaching behind to pull off his bow. His hand waved in the air for a few seconds before Fili reached out and lifted the end up so he could grasp it and pull it off. I knew they lived in houses, just didn't think they would be this big. Didn't think hobbits were this big, Fili retorted, flashing a smirk at Bilbo. Kili snickered and spun around to face Bilbo and paused. The impish smile slid off his face and his dark eyes widened. Oi, Mr. Baggins, you alright? You look a bit unsteady there, he said, reaching out a hand as if to catch Bilbo. All right? No, I'm not all right. I saw you die with your brother. I saw you die trying to defend the uncle you love so much. I saw you both die, and now here you are again, alive and whole and so very, very young. Bilbo choked back a sob and gave Kili a smiling, bouncing, fiery, alive Kili what he hoped was a reassuring smile. Oh, yes, I'm fine. Just feeling the day catching up to me, you know? Why don't you two head to the dining room for dinner? Dwalin and Balin have already arrived. Keely hesitated, brown eyes flickering over him before he finally shrugged and turned away. He wandered off to find the dining room, with Feely trailing after him, also shooting the hobbit a confused look, but also did not press for an answer. Bilbo waited until he heard the joyful sound of greetings echo through his house before he finally allowed himself to fall back against his door for the second time that day. Never in all his years had he ever imagined such a pain as he felt when he looked upon the brothers Feely and Keely. To see them as they once were, brilliant and bright and so very full of life, and to know the fate that awaited them. He could not afford to fail. Seeing those two just made his resolve even stronger. No matter what, he would see that every one of his companions survived the Battle of the Five Armies, even if it cost him his own life. There was another pounding knock on his door. The strength of it rattled both the door and the hobbit, and he knew that, barring Thorin, it was the rest of the dwarves. And so Bilbo straightened up, steeled himself for the chaos, and opened the door. He was then promptly thrown to the ground as an avalanche of dwarves fell on top of him. Do you suppose I broke something? Bilbo asked Gandalf as he was looked over and prodded. The wizard made a considering sound in the back of his throat. Unlikely, but you will have some bruising. Probably be so tomorrow. He winced. He was not looking forward to riding with a bruised bum. Lovely. I am again very sorry, Mr. Baggett. Bomber, large, clumsy, but sweet Bomber, apologized again for the 5th time since tripping and causing all the dwarves to fall onto the hobbit. I'm not the most graceful dwarf on his feet. That implies you ever had grace to begin with. Dory, who was just as uptight as he recalled, muttered, rubbing the front of his head where a clear red bump could be seen. Bomber visibly wilted like a flower without sunlight at the remark, and Bilbo felt his annoyance rise at the sight. Come now, it was an accident. He apologized for it and meant no harm. Let it go and move on. Dory stared at him, clearly startled by the sudden rebuke, while Bomber simply gawked. At the corner of his eyes, Bilbo could see a few of the others also staring, but paid them no mind. He recalled quite clearly how mean and downright vicious the dwarves could be to Bomber simply because of his size and clumsiness. He had no intention of allowing that to continue again, when he knew exactly how good of a dwarf and friend Bomber really was. An arm was swung around Bilbo's neck, and he suddenly found himself in the warm hold of Bolfer. The miner wore the same ridiculous hat and scarf that he remembered so well, with his mattock strapped to his back. The hobbit could even smell the dwarf's favorite pipe reed, long bottom leaf, because Bolfer always had glass, interlaced within the miner's old coat. Aye, our host is right. Now is not the time to lay blame, Bolfer commented, smiling the dimple smile that he was so well known for. His eyes, though, were steely as he leveled them upon the older dwarf before him. After all, we've all made mistakes, and took a tumble or two, yes? Dory rolled his eyes but did not agree. Instead, he pulled himself to his feet and made his way to where his two brothers sat already eating, clearly done with the conversation. Forgive dear old Dory. Afraid he's a bit of a grump most days, Bolfer commented lightly, patting the hobbit on the shoulder and releasing him. My thanks for standing up to him, though. Sometimes he forgets not everyone is as stone-hearted as he is. I'm sure he has his reasons, Bilbo pointed out, not about to pick sides in this obvious contest of wills. He knew that his dwarves would all eventually become as close as brothers, but that would not happen until they started their journey, and had a chance to build those relationships. For now, all they were to each other were comrades with the same goal. Their real bonds would not develop until later. Aye, that he does, agreed Bolfer, slowly nodding while obviously studying the hobbit. Good of you to recognize that, and thank you for sticking up for my brother. You're welcome. He did not deserve such a comment over something so small, he said honestly, giving the still silent Bomber a smile. The rounded dwarf smiled back slowly while Bolfer beamed without restraint. Well said. Now I think it's time we join the others before they eat everything and leave us with nothing but the crumbs, Bolfer declared, taking his brother towards the table of food. Bomber, of course, followed without complaint. He watched them go before turning his gaze to the wizard beside him. Gandalf looked considering as he studied the hobbit. It was a look he remembered well, having seen it every time he had done something that was not expected of him. You seem confused, Master Gandalf, he commented, leaning back against the chair he had been dragged to after being at the bottom of a dwarven pancake. Something on your mind? No, it's nothing. Simply the ponderings of an old man, Gandalf dismissed, just as he expected him to. Even as good friends, the wizard rarely revealed his inner thoughts to him. So what do you think of our current company? Not quite what you were expecting, I would think. Bilbo turned his attention to the collection of dwarves centered around his table. Dwalin was engaged in an arm wrestling contest with Goyn, whose resemblance to his son was uncanny now that he saw him as a young dwarf again, while Fili and Kili and Bofer cheered them on. Balin was in a deep discussion with Bifur, who still indeed had the old orc axe embedded into his forehead. That seemed to involve Kuzdal and much hand gestures. Bomber had gone straight to eating next to the young Ori and silent Nori. Oin, in his familiar brown cloak and white braids, was engaged in trying to eat as much food as possible, while next to him, Nori tried to avoid the spittle of stray food. It was all such a familiar sight of energy and life that Bilbo could not fight the warmth that overtook his heart. In all his worry and nostalgia, he had forgotten that there had been good times on his journey too. Stories and songs told around a blazing campfire, jokes whispered under breath during the long walks, and the comfort that came from knowing you were safe and loved. His dwarves had shown him a new side of life that he would have never known in the Shire. With them he had learned of honor and hope and sacrifice, and had grown from a stuffy, cowardly, and selfish hobbit into a brave and kind one. The dwarves of Erebor had changed him into someone better, and Bilbo could never forget that. They are something else. Not what I was expecting, certainly, but that's what makes them so grand. I do not think they would be so mesmerizing if they were anything else but this, he said honestly, never looking away from the group of dwarves. He could feel Gandalf staring at him with his ancient eyes, and knew that there would be a comment to soon follow. But before the wizard could even open his mouth, there was a great pounding on his front door that made every dwarf go silent. Gandalf slowly rose to his feet and gave the others a knowing look. "He's here," he announced, and Bilbo's heart stopped.